All right, good morning, guys. It is a beautiful Minnesota morning this morning. My wife was like, what's the weather like back home in Minnesota? I was like, it's rainy and 43 degrees. So she was like, well, it's sunny here in Colorado, like it always is. What can I do? I'm trying to get back there as fast as I can, you know. We're going to talk today, this morning and this afternoon, about what we're calling the fortresses of the family, church, and state. And I want to start out by explaining that terminology, because that specific way of talking about those things is my own, but the concept is quite old. And I want to set everything that we're doing today in terms of the small catechism, because I don't think that what we're talking about today is particularly specific to pastors. It's not specific vocationally. It's really helpful, I think, to everybody. And the way that it gets, the topics that we're taking up, the way that it gets discussed in the small catechism is in a section that often is not even taught. So a lot of people don't even know it's in the small catechism. So you would say in the small catechism there are 6 chief parts. But in the original small catechism, there's also a booklet on performing marriages and a booklet on performing baptisms, and a section that is still always in there called the Table of Duties. It's a collection of Bible passages arranged according to 2 sides of a set of a relationship, whether you're talking about the government or the family or the church. All of it's set out there with contrasting responsibilities. So you've got one section to husbands and another section to wives. So you've got one section to preachers and another section to hearers, right? And the way that that's set out is arranged along the lines of something that Luther talks about elsewhere as, and this is his term, and then I'll explain mine, estates. That's an old word. It's a legal word, actually, in a European context. You might have, if you ever heard about the French Revolution, you might have heard about the Estates General. So that's the group that gets called together by the king that's eventually going to vote to, kill the king. Okay, those are the estates. Those are different groups in society of which a society is composed. So you've got commoners and nobles and clergy in the case of France. And in Luther's case, when he's talking about estates, he's saying these are the different realms or settings that life occurs in. So you can be in multiple different estates in that way. You could be part of a family and a citizen and part of a church at the same time. So it's sort of an institutional way to think about something that we often talk about as vocation, right? So we talk about, what is my vocation as a father? Or what is my vocation as a Christian? Or what is my vocation as a doctor, right? If you want to look at the vocation not in terms of just what is the calling on my particular life, that's all the Latin word vocation means, is calling, not just what is the calling on my particular life, what are my responsibilities, but what is this group that I'm part of, this hospital, this family, this congregation, what are we here for? Did God say that we're here for anything particularly? And that's a way to think about this concept of estate. And if you wanted to expand that to all different parts of life, maybe you could. Right? And this is an idea that a lot of Lutherans in the United States have had a lot of trouble even remembering, let alone using. So I'm not sure that anybody's done that. You could think about it, though. The difficulty here is that Luther's going to continually return not to a bunch of different estates, but really just to 3. Really just to 3. And we'll talk about their interrelationship to start out with, but those 3 are the ones that we're talking about as family, church, and state. So let me explain my own terminology here. Number one, I stopped using the term estate because people found it confusing. I gave you guys the background because this is a seminary and you should be able to handle like kind of a weird historical concept. But for normal people, I don't go on about the Estates General or the French Revolution or anything like that. I started using the word fortress because it seemed like a clear concept for people to understand what is God doing when he puts us not just as individuals with callings, but as individuals with callings in these groups with their own purpose outside of us. My family is bigger than me. My church is bigger than me. My state is bigger than me. What is he doing here? He's saying God has set up certain ways that life operates, and I need to figure out how I fit into that. So I started calling it a fortress, partly for this reason, that I found people were extremely confused about what their life was directed toward. So it's not that they didn't know they were supposed to read their Bibles, or it's not that they didn't know that they should spend more time with their kids or something, but that they had a lack of direction about what those different parts of life were for, and that talking about it as a fortress enabled them to think of it as it's going to be there. God set up the family, God set up the church, God set up the state, and you want to, like a person going into a fortress for refuge, go into and live in those things that God has set up. And that would be a better way to live a life or to direct a life than to try to figure it out on your own. And if you think about the table of duties within the small catechism, it's going to come at the end, but it is directed to give a shape to life so that I don't continually wonder, okay, well, what is the government supposed to be doing? Not just what is it doing, but what should it be doing? And is it doing those things that it should? Or is it not at all? Okay. So we started using the word fortress really just as a synonym for estate, one that in some ways was a little more readily understandable to people. We also started using it because we want to think of these groups, these estates in Luther's terminology, as part of what I think is really individualistically discussed as spiritual warfare. So the concept of difficulty, evil, even demons, affliction, tribulation, the bearing of crosses, all of that gets categorized under spiritual warfare, but spiritual warfare tends to be discussed in purely individual terms. What kinds of prayers are you engaged in? What kinds of things are you doing to ward off such influences in your life? And that when you think about God putting you by nature into groups with other people, into a family, into a church, into a state, then you're already dealing with a situation where you are not fighting alone, which of course makes sense, but we just tend not to think of it that way. We tend to think about our Christian lives as mainly our Christian lives. And a lot of preaching is therefore, somewhat unlike the New Testament, is directed towards individual Christians in their lives. And it's not that that's illegitimate. You should just notice that both Luther's concept of estates, as well as a lot of the preaching of the New Testament about Christians' lives, is directed to groups, or like we talked about last night, classes of people. Young men, this, or wives, that, or whatever. And the table of duties is arranged in the same way. It's just a collection of Bible passages, but it's all directed to groups of people so that your life is not really lived in an individual manner. We're starting with the family this morning for several reasons. The first one of which is biblical. And that is that family, as we say when we conduct a marriage in the LCMS, this is what our liturgical rite for marriage repeats every time, is that the family is, this is my word, primordial, meaning the family is there from the first. The family is there from the first. If you think about Genesis 1 and 2, which we'll work with a little bit later, that's the clearest place to go to talk about this. But you're saying that at the beginning of humanity, and this is already a statement about what we mentioned last night as theological anthropology, the doctrine of man. At the beginning of humanity, we're not alone or we're not struggling with other primates for life or something. We are put into a family. We all originate in a family. Adam and Eve, of one blood, he made every nation on the earth, they're going to say in Acts. So that when you're talking about family, you're talking about something that amazingly, really, existed before the fall and endured the fall as an institution. So you're not talking about something that is lately created or the roles for which we have just recently come up with, or we came up with them in the 1950s and now some of us want that back and some of us never want to see that again. We're talking about something that predates the fall. It is the earliest institution in human history. So if it survives the fall, that doesn't mean that it's unaffected by the fall, but it does mean that that needs to be honored as rather amazing. So the family is primordial. In addition to that, the family is essential to the health of the other fortresses or estates. So let me explain that in terms of the church and the state. You can have a church that has no families whatsoever. It is certainly possible. But if you had such a church, if you went down your membership roster and nobody in that church was related to anybody else by blood, I can almost guarantee you that that situation wouldn't endure for very long. Somebody else would become related to somebody else by marriage, and then eventually your members would become related by blood. That the way that human life operates, because it's based on the family, means that how families are formed and endure severely affects, for good or for ill, the health of churches. And that when families are not formed or don't endure, or they break up all over again and get reformed, that obviously affects the church. And this is not just a statement on an emotional level, it's also a statement, obviously people feel bad, it's awkward, it's difficult, people stop going to church, whatever, but it's also a statement on the level of what happens in the family affects the church in almost any regard you can think of. Luther actually talks about this in the Large Catechism when he talks about the fourth commandment. That he pictures the fourth commandment there in the Large Catechism specifically as a kind of hinge between the two tables of the law. So the love of God in the first table of the law, commandments 1, 2, 3, and then the love of the neighbor reflected in 5 through 10 really hinges on what is learned or is not learned in honoring father and mother. So that the fourth commandment is your hinge, and the tables open and close, sort of like a little diptych, right? A little two-piece set on that fourth commandment. It's also essential for the functioning of the state. And I choose the word functioning carefully because when you have familial disintegration, or people don't form families, or they form families and then the families are gone, the families appear to be temporary, that's going to affect the state on all kinds of levels that everyone from a criminologist to a sociologist could easily predict, right? If I have a rising rate of fatherlessness, what is going to happen to the violent crime rate in this city? It's really not that hard to figure out. So when we're talking about the family's essential nature to the other estates, we're also talking about things, and I want to be clear about this particularly in this lecture, we're talking about things that you don't have to be a Christian to perceive. The thing about these estates or fortresses is that especially when they are dysfunctional, non-Christians can easily perceive it. Okay? So we're not talking about things that are matters necessarily only of special revelation. We're talking about matters, particularly with the family, matters of what would be traditionally called natural law, so that non-Christians also can perceive and act accordingly, or at least understand how badly something has gone wrong. If the family is essential to the health of the other estates, the family is also, and this is going to be the burden of a lot of the rest of what I'll say in this first session, the family is also, of the estates or fortresses, is the most endangered. So if you were going to take various animal or plant species and say, we're not worried about that. There are plenty of oak trees still, but this American chestnut is dying out. The family is more like an American chestnut than it is like an oak tree. And it's endangered in a couple of different ways. Okay. We're going to look at it as beginnings and then endurance. In terms of its beginnings, or what you could call family formation, all kinds of metrics of what is going on with the family are going poorly. Families are being formed later than ever. A higher proportion of the population than in a very long time is never getting married. Okay, so that's beginnings, and then you could even talk anecdotally, which many of our youth do, about how difficult it is to find somebody to marry. Those questions about family formation mean that if I'm trying to enter into something that's essential for all of the other estates, and I can't even get really started, that's going to delay my sense of everything else. So this is why you're going to find that if you are never married, you are, just statistically speaking, least likely to be in a church. Okay. Then you've got sociopolitical changes that are affecting the family's endurance. Among those, one of the positive indicators actually is how the divorce rate has gone down. The question there is, has the divorce rate gone down in recent decades because we're getting divorced less, or because we're getting married less in the first place? So those are things to think about. But if you think about what's going on there, what's most endangered, and I want to be clear about this, is that the traditional goal of family formation, which is procreation of children, the children are what get endangered when the family is endangered. So if the family never forms, but the children come into existence, then the children don't quite ever know where they belong. That's one issue. So if the family fails to form, but the children are born, if they are lucky enough to be born, if they're not aborted, if they are born, then who they belong to, or where they belong, or how they belong is always an uncertain matter for them. Similarly, if the family doesn't endure, the children are most endangered. And I don't think that this is strange. If you think about what happens in the promise given to Adam, it's that the two become one flesh, and you can understand the one flesh as the man and the woman coming together and thinking the same thoughts and living a life together. But it is quite literally true in the case of the child that he is the one flesh. So even if mom and dad split and live on opposite sides of the country, he has to go on being part mom and part dad, regardless of who he lives with or how often or where he goes. So when the family is endangered after it's formed, the child has to suffer the pain most keenly of the fact that the family has broken apart. This, of course, has to do with, if you think about children, this has to do with the possibility of there being a future. I recently traveled to a congregation that I'm advising on kind of revitalization things, for lack of a better term, right? How do they keep going? How do they reach out to their neighbors? This kind of thing. And it was far away, so my mom came to babysit most of the kids, and we took the baby with us. We took the baby with us. Baby was a little grumpy during the service, even though she had had a great night's sleep and got all the attention of both of us the whole weekend, right? But the baby's a little grumpy during the service, so the baby's crying, Baby's crying, it's fine. I've preached over babies crying before. Jen's not flustered. Babies cry, it's fine. They were so happy to hear the baby crying because they had not heard a baby cry in that church in years, right? So what you've got here is that when the family doesn't form, or the family doesn't endure, or the family is not retained in the church, and we'll talk in the second lecture about how the church is connected to these things particularly, then what you also have is, not coincidentally, no sense of a future. Like, you're not sure where any of this is going to go because you don't see any human beings who could actually take it there in 20 years. They're just not even around, right? In order to base our thinking so that we can have a sense of what the family is, we're going to work with some concepts from Genesis 1 and 2, and then talk about what we can recover on that basis and from other parts of Scripture, and then also practices to recover. So we'll do Genesis 1 and 2, and then talk about concepts and practices. Okay. So we're not doing like a Bible study this morning or this afternoon, but I want to take some things that I'm sure you're familiar with from those places, and I'm using them so that your mind can be fixed in a certain place in the same way that Luther fixes specifically exhortation or Christian life in the table of duties. But we're not just talking about duties, we're also talking about institutions, right? Or fortresses. What has God set up? So what does he set up in Genesis 1 and 2? Well, he sets up a family. What is a family? It's one man and one woman. That pattern of one and one is going to be replicated also in the way that he deals with the church. It may be helpful, therefore, to recognize that the practice of polygamy witnessed throughout the Old Testament is, like so much else in the Old Testament, a silent and sad commentary on people's ability to quickly depart from his institutions. People will sometimes ask, well, why was polygamy allowed in the Old Testament? Well, it wasn't. It happened. Lots of things are not allowed, and the way to understand what's wrong or right is not for the narrator to step in, whether it's Moses or anybody else, and say, by the way, this is wrong, because the Bible doesn't operate that way, particularly when it narrates history. It shows you what God sets up and then shows you what men do with it, and you make your judgments accordingly, right? So the institution here is one man and one woman. They are unlike the rest of creation in that they are to have dominion and subdue that creation. They are like the rest of animate creation in that they are to be fruitful and multiply. So this is something where when you're talking about the family, one thing to say about the family is that the family is a site of wealth, but biblically speaking, that wealth is not monetary, but personal. Okay? So let me say it this way, is that whereas we kind of usually have a problem today with children, numbers of children, how many children, etc., and we have kind of no problem with numbers or amounts of money, the Bible is the opposite. In the Bible, having a lot of money can be a problem. Having a lot of children is not. So if you compare Psalm 127 and 128, you don't have a similar praise of having a ton of money. If you have a lot of money, that is its own difficulty. You can manage it. Money is not evil. Its love is evil, right? Obviously reflected in Judas, whom John reminds you, Judas was putting his hand in the till the whole time. Right? Only John's gospel mentions that kind of fascinatingly. So Judas had a long history of loving money, but the love of money is the problem. But when you have a lot of money, it becomes its own problem. So Genesis 13, for example, where they have to divide their territory because they have prospered so much in the land, Abram and Lot, doesn't have a parallel in having a bunch of children. So that the produce or the production or the fruitfulness of the marriage is actually in and of itself already in Genesis 1 a blessing. And it's interesting that that's the way that the Formula of Concord picks up on that verse in order to discuss a blessing that is set up and then remains forever, and it compares that actually to the institution of the Lord's Supper. That the Lord's, when he institutes things, whether the family or the Lord's Supper, he sets it up with words, and then those words abide forever. The thing to notice about chapter 2, Genesis 2, so in the medieval church or medieval Christianity, they would discuss the purpose of the family as proles, fides, and sacramentum, meaning children. Okay, proles. Fides is fidelity, and sacramentum is the mystery reflected in the marriage, like Ephesians 5, of how Christ loves the church, and the church is faithful to Christ. That second one, fides, or faithfulness, is what's reflected in chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2. Because what you have there is this reality that he is not well, he does not prosper alone. So when you think about loneliness, which is something that particularly in my experience today, young men especially are afflicted by, it might be something we generally suffer from as modern Americans, but particularly young men are afflicted by loneliness, is that part of the reason that that affliction is there in such depth and intensity for a lot of guys is because it is not actually good for him to be alone. So if you take Genesis 1 and you've got good, good, very good, those approvals of the Creator on the creation, you remember that clearly. Notice that the next chapter, it is not good for the man to be alone. So what needs to happen is that someone like him, but opposite him, that's the best I can do with the Hebrew preposition, ezer kunegdo, right? That's opposite him. So he looks in her face and she looks in his, but they are unlike each other. They fit together, right? They meet with one another eye to eye, will be with him. You can understand this when Paul begins to talk in 1 Corinthians 7 about whether someone should take a wife, because it seems that by that time they're wondering, or some Christians are wondering, if it would be better just because of all the problems connected with marriage and connected with married life and adultery and all the difficulties, if you just had nothing to do with each other, right? And the literal Greek there in 1 Corinthians 7 is, they have written to Paul saying, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, not to have anything to do with her, right? And so Paul's going to say, it could be fine if you want to remain unmarried like I am, okay? It would be fine for the sake of the mission. And I can tell you as somebody with a family, it is much easier to travel if you don't have a family, right? So Paul can carry out his own message, his own mission faster and farther than seemingly anybody else, because he has put aside what he calls there his exousia, usually gets translated as right. You could talk about permission or license, or it's translated in Matthew 28, 19, and 20 as authority, same word. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. That's exousia. But he has a right, just like all of the other apostles, to take a believing wife. Okay. Why is that right laid down? In the Lutheran Confessions, it's going to be taken up to explain why the pastors can get married. But it's not, they don't get married just because they're pastors. They get married because they are men, because that's the way that their nature is set up. Okay. So this idea that this is natural and needs to happen, and it's very unusual that Paul puts aside that life or that kind of life, is going to inform both the concepts and the practices we'll talk about in the rest of our time. But I want you to notice there that what gets established in Genesis 1 and 2 is going to be followed through conceptually in the rest of Scripture. So if Paul's going to talk about what is right or obvious for anyone, he's going to be doing that on the basis of Genesis 1 and 2. And when you're thinking about these fortresses, you're thinking about things that, like when we talk about the institution of the Lord's Supper or the institution of Holy Baptism, like other things in the Small Catechism, we're talking about what God has set up and then how we fit into that, rather than how we might want to reimagine that or live apart from that or outside of that institution. Rather, it would be much better if we just figured out how to fit into that, right? How to conform our lives to that. So let's talk about 3 concepts, and then we'll talk about 3 practices, and that'll get us to time for questions toward the end. Do we have until 10? Is that the session? Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right. So here are the 3 practices, and I'm starting out with a concept that is probably the most vague outside the Bible, but really isn't that vague inside the Bible, and that is the concept of nature. And the reason that nature is vague outside the Bible, and therefore vague for many Christians today as well, is because it is a word that a little unusually is in the New Testament, but has a long prehistory to it. Okay, physis in Greek has a long prehistory to it, and Hebrew doesn't have a single word for it. Partly because it was developed by Greeks, that word, in order to discuss what is the basis of things. How do I figure out what something just is, right? How is a tree different from a dog? What is its nature? And then what do I do because of that? Okay. So it's got a long prehistory before the New Testament is written in Greek philosophy, so that when it gets taken up in the New Testament, I don't think it's that complex, honestly, but it doesn't just originate in the New Testament, and therefore the concept is going to take on all kinds of different shades of meaning over time. So let's do a positive explanation of what it is, and then also try to see how it might be talked about in the Old Testament, and then we'll explain why it's so fuzzy for many people today. Think about the way that Paul uses the word in Romans 1, for example, or 1 Corinthians 11, talking about men and women's hair. He uses it generally inside rhetorical questions, or in terms in Romans 1 of obvious statements. So in 1 Corinthians, he's going to say, does not nature itself teach you? Or in Romans 1, he will instead talk about how people are doing things against nature, right? Against nature. And what that means is that it's sort of like in Romans 1 particularly, because men are sinning, nature is there almost like a brick wall. And you can do whatever you want, and you can drive your car as fast as you want, but when you hit the brick wall, certain things are going to happen to you in your car. So you can think whatever you want and feel whatever you want and live however you want, but then you're going to hit that brick wall, and there's nothing you can do about that, because it's a structure set up outside of you that you either fit into and are happy with, or refuse to fit into, are unhappy, and so suffer. Okay. So when he's talking about hair length, he's talking about, isn't it obvious by nature that the sexes are different, and that gets reflected in how they look in 1 Corinthians 11. Now, how would you take that up, for example, in the Old Testament? You'd have to use synonyms, as you very often do, because Hebrew and Greek are not just different languages, they come out of different civilizations, practically speaking. You could think a lot in this way about the Old Testament notion of a way. What is the way of a righteous man? Or what is the way, for instance, in Job or in Proverbs, of an eagle? Because the word is used to cover not only the differing ways that people live, like Psalm 1 is a really clear example, but it's also used to cover the ways that different beings God has made behave, right? So here are things I do not understand, right? Or when God confronts Job near the end of Job, he's going to say, were you there when I made? Do you understand the way of? And then he describes various animals that even if you live in Colorado, it's kind of hard to observe, because they live way up high on mountains where it's hard to get to, right, and hard to see. Those are his questions because man can't fathom the ways of those things. God has established their way. So it seems to me that the notion of a derech is the closest thing that you're going to get in Hebrew to a Greek notion of a physis, a nature, that a way and a nature are very similar to each other. I'm sure you could find other synonyms, but that's one that comes up all over the place. It's also one that the New Testament is going to use to describe particularly life in Christ. So Paul's going to tell people in 1 Corinthians to imitate his ways in Christ Jesus, right? A whole existence, all right? So the reason I don't actually think this is terribly biblically complicated is because if you have any experience with certain kinds of animals, or you've worked with little kids, or you've coached basketball for a certain amount of time, you understand that human beings are not as unique as they think they are. They have ways or natures that are set up for them at different kinds of life or in similar situations that get reflected over and over and over again. And they can push against that, as the guys in Romans 1 are pushing back against their own natures and rebelling against the maker of those natures in the way that they're living sexually. Or you can align your life with those ways and accept their existence and try to harmonize yourself and your soul and your thinking with those natures or ways, but they're going to exist whether you acknowledge them or not. That's why particularly non-Christians can recognize some of these things, because they have to do largely with matters of observation about life, about people, about the creation. And this is the most basic meaning of the concept of natural law. Okay. Natural right is an extension of that, like we talk about a right to life, but it's based on the idea of nature. It's in the nature of an unborn child to be a separate human being from his mother, even though he is totally dependent on her, as a 2-month-old born child also is totally dependent on his mother, right? But if you don't have a concept of nature, it's kind of hard to get a concept of natural right, and it's certainly hard to recognize a concept of natural law. Modern people usually are not taught these things, or they're not taught about a concept of nature, or if they are taught the word nature, it almost always means stuff out there, the environment. So that has its own laws, right? Why does it not snow so much on the Front Range of Colorado where I live as it does in the mountains? They could learn that, but they don't apply that to human beings. So human beings can do whatever they want. The idea, therefore, that a boy could turn into a girl or a girl into a boy is really just an extension of something that a lot of people already think, which is they can shape their own lives however they want. Their life isn't very much, if at all, determined by having a nature. That, of course, is going to affect how they think about the family, too. Because the family can be infinitely malleable or changeable if human beings themselves are malleable and changeable. So the first concept, and really the primary one to recover, is nature, because the other two are going to flow from it. So the second one is, I'm using a Greek word. I'll have an English synonym for it. The Greek word is telos, in the sense of a goal or a purpose. So you could probably, if you wanted an English word for it, you could say purpose. And purpose is according to nature, right? So if I have a certain nature, then my purpose is going to be conformed to that nature. It can't be against that nature. It can't be outside that nature. And the illustration I like to use, and this works better in Minnesota than it does where I'm originally from on the East Coast, where people just are not as tall, is I might be 5'10", maybe. And here's the problem. What if I always wanted to be an NBA center? Well, guess what? It doesn't matter what I want. I can't find my purpose as an NBA center. Not even in the really early NBA where everyone was smaller could I have been a center at 5'10". That's just the way it works according to my nature. In this case, my genetics and childhood nutrition, right? So that's the way that purpose operates. If you see what something is, if you perceive its nature, then from its nature you can discern its purpose. Now, if you're tall enough to be an NBA center, and maybe some of you are, or you know people who are, then they're probably way too tall to be Kentucky Derby winning jockeys, right? Or famous race car drivers, because you need to be smaller and slighter to drive an F1 car or even a stock car. So what you're doing here is you observe nature and then you perceive purpose. If you can't observe nature, so let's say that even in your own mind, let alone in your conversation with other people, it is off limits for you to observe distinct differences, enduring differences between men and women in how they think, in what they do, in how they behave, right? Pertaining to the family specifically. Let's say that you've just put that off limits. You don't want to think that. You want to think everybody's basically the same. Then it's going to be really hard to discern purpose within a marriage for a distinct mother and father. Maybe you could just have one parent, and maybe you think you would be happier, because it's not like they're really all that different, right? So the issue here is that if I can't see nature, I won't see purpose. This happens on a really high conceptual level in evolutionary theory, right? Evolutionary theory says that based on environmental advantage, an organism could turn into almost anything else. And that's what you're asked to believe on a macro scale. That you go from primordial, not a family, but primordial soup, and eventually chemical reactions advance over time to produce you. Everything is malleable. Nothing has any particular purpose except survival. Since that makes no sense on the micro scale of an individual human life, you're not struggling to survive in your marriage. The two of you are just very unhappy with each other. You still think you're malleable or interchangeable, but at the same time, you can't really figure out your purpose because you're not accepting that there's a nature there. Now, I don't really think that that's facetious, even if it kind of sounds funny, because the third concept is the one that on the ground I find to be most common that people are confused about, and that is the concept of role. Now, when you talk about the table of duties in the Small Catechism, what you're talking about are roles. What is the role of a citizen relative to the state? Or what is the role of a husband relative to his wife or relative to his children? But the role is on the basis of the nature, and then the purposes derived from that nature are then expressed in the role. Right? Obviously, if I'm missing nature, then I'm missing purpose, then I'm obviously missing role. So here's a situation that frequently happens, is that after a certain amount of time being married, people run into some kind of very specific roadblock in their marriage. Issues are usually interrelated. It's not like they all have wildly different issues, or that the issues are completely unrelated to each other or completely isolated. But what I very often find is that confusion and that difficulty is based on not having admitted that they have different natures as man and woman to begin with. That has then confused them about purposes, which has then confused them, and very concretely probably why they're there, about roles and how those roles play out. So it's sort of like a play where everybody agrees we're in the play, but then I can't really decide what character I want to be, and neither can you, and we all have each other's lines half memorized. So of course the play doesn't really get put on. We just sort of know vaguely what it's about, but we're not actually able to produce it successfully. The other reason that I use the word role is that you may be familiar with the discussion of vocation of Luther using the concept of masks of God, that we are in encountering each other in our vocations, we're encountering God's masks. He operates behind these, and this has a whole different meaning after COVID, but it's kind of it's a theater analogy. It's not a public health analogy. Is that we're encountering God's operation through that fireman or my mother or whoever it may be, right? But what you can see here is that relies on the fireman knowing what a fireman is supposed to do and the mother knowing what a mother is supposed to do. And that if the role is not actually played, then you are not actually being served by that person because he's a fireman but doesn't want to put out fires, or whatever the malfunction may be. So these concepts of nature and purpose, and role are all ones that we need to recover if we've lost them. Probably people are going to notice the role thing first before they move up to a higher conceptual level. They're going to come into contact with it through the role. And I say role too, because when we think about what it is that we are supposed to be doing in a family or a church or a state, we're also dealing with something that doesn't have to do particularly with how we feel about it or how we are handling it, which is kind of a common psychological focus we have today, almost natural. It has a lot more to do with simply what is it? So it doesn't particularly matter if I would have preferred to be another position than the position I played in playing baseball, which was always catcher. If I behave like a first baseman, that's fine for me. Maybe I want to be a first baseman. Maybe I wish I had been left-handed and taller or something. But because I was really well set up to be a catcher, I both was right-handed and thought that I knew what everyone else should be doing, which is what catchers do, right? Okay. Because I was really well set up to be a catcher, I have to learn how to play that role. It really doesn't matter how I feel about it. It's for the good of everybody if I play what is given me according to my nature. And that doesn't mean really that emotion is illegitimate in Christian life. It simply means that it's not primary. That you could have emotion that either accords with or doesn't accord with your role, but that doesn't really change your role. David isn't chosen as king, and then promises are not made to him on the basis of how he feels about it. And I'm not saying that in a kind of, Ben Shapiro type, facts don't care about your feelings or something. I'm saying that because very often, particularly in family, emotion overrides everything else. So if emotion is driving all thinking and I don't feel like I'm in love anymore, that's going to destroy my role. So that's why we go nature, purpose, role. Let's talk about practices. And these practices relate, first of all, to the two issues of endangerment we mentioned earlier with family formation and with family endurance. And then finally, as a tie-in to the rest of the table of duties, with how thinking about money specifically and how the household is managed ties into the family. Now, there are lots of things that we could have said about practices. I hope I've stimulated your thinking, particularly in talking about concepts. But in talking about practices, we don't want to say everything we could possibly say, but we want to, again, stimulate your thinking about the topic. And that'll open it up not just for time for questions or comments, but I hope also for your life in Christ. So regarding the questions of endangerment to family formation, you have to put, first of all, prioritizing family formation as a life goal. Prioritizing family formation as a life goal. I'll give you an example of how we used to do this in the Missouri Synod that some people are now trying to revive, and I actually am in contact with a group also in Canada, in addition to one in the United States that's trying to do the same thing. We used to have a group called Walther League. So this wasn't about reading the proper distinction between law and gospel or Walther's sermons or anything else that we talked about yesterday. This was about going with people from your congregation, usually meeting in an area as well with kids from other congregations and getting together. And there was a whole manual for having fun activities. And I guess it was, I'm not much for group activities, but I guess it was fun for a lot of people. I don't know. I would just rather read a book. But what happened, and what I can tell you happened, because I have seen it in any congregation I've either served or even been to, is that it promoted family formation. That was ultimately the purpose. And that in both congregations that I've served, as well as in others, I have a fairly large number of people, all over the age of 70 now, who met in Walther League. Now, sometimes they met in their own congregation, but usually they met in a group of people from a larger metro area, and they got together, and that's how the family formed. And the purpose was that the church doesn't need to have a ton of stuff going on. Walther League predates enormous amounts of church programming, and was kind of dead by the time we began to program lots of other things in the 70s and 80s. It really goes along the same time that we in the Missouri Synod were still emphasizing Lutheran education very heavily. So that if you were thinking about a church having programming, essentially the church's programming is going to be a school plus Walther League, and the rest of it's going to be optional. What that's going to do is it's going to prioritize the family forming and the kids knowing why they're supposed to form said Lutheran family. And it's something that seems a little corny to some people. It used to be something that people would sort of make fun of, but now they realize that we don't have anything like that. And so kids don't know each other, and so families often don't get formed in a way that is very peaceful. There's less negotiation and less difficulty. They have the same faith background. Things work better. So practices to recover would involve prioritizing family formation. Okay? That people know each other, that they're familiar with each other, and that they are able to, in a setting where those roles are clear, form families where those roles are played. In addition to that, and this has to do with family endurance or resiliency, is that we give people the capacity to do family-centric decision-making. So a really clear example of this is that very often we have difficulty scheduling funerals because grandma who has died lives in one place, her kids live in 3 different places, the grandkids live in 10 different places, and all of those places are different. So it's not even exactly clear where the funeral is going to be, at least for a day or two. And what happens there is that there's a certain amount of loneliness in her before her passing, obviously, because she doesn't naturally want to be separate from all of those people, but also that because she's separate from them, it's really hard for anyone's schedules to align. When we talk about that, though, what we mean by being busy or being overbooked or not having the time to get to such a thing as your grandma's funeral is that what you're really talking about is that other things have taken its place. In talking about this, I understand it's difficult. This is also why I think in talking about the table of duties or the third use of the law or how you deal with your family, it's always better to think of it in terms of wisdom rather than rage or condemnation. Because pretty much everybody is caught up in difficulties in this way, and life is difficult to make wise decisions about. So I'm not saying any of this by way of saying, boy, I wish everyone made great decisions like I always do. Of course not. What I'm noticing, however, is how unnatural it is for families to be so split apart and for their schedules, even for final events, of a person's life, like her funeral, to be way down a list of priorities also involving youth sports or whatever else, and the cost of the plane tickets for everybody, and all of that difficulty and stress surrounding something that is obviously important. And when they miss it, or when that person is gone, the real weight of her absence will be felt in a way that it wasn't when she was alive. So knowing that, it would be better if we could be taught earlier to make decisions in view of those things that we will later learn by experience. Okay. That the wisdom of older generations who realize, yes, I moved that far away and it was really hard or whatever, could be passed on to younger generations so that younger generations can benefit from that experience. So there's also an issue here where it's not just that family formation needs to be prioritized, but that the capacity to make decisions so that the family can be at the center of a life, the way that does come naturally, and the reason why it's grievous when the family is embittered or split up or whatever, why that is so difficult is because it feels unnatural to be at war with your own family, just like it does to be so far apart from them all of the time. Older generations that have either learned that or always knew that or learned it by experience would be very helpful in teaching younger generations about these things. Various churches have programs somewhat like that. I would say that the old Walther League didn't have anything like that, but at the same time, I'm not sure that in the 1940s they were quite so worried about families forming or enduring. So it could be helpful here for older generations to give wisdom about family endurance explicitly and intentionally to younger ones. The third practice is what we're going to call home economics, not in the sense of a class you may have taken where I, for instance, put way too much salt in some chocolate chip cookies and ruined everything for my team in home ec class, not that class, which I more or less flunked probably. But the way that the table of duties talks about what we would call economic matters or financial matters, which is, it talks about workers and it talks about employers, but all of that is figured in terms of the good of the household. And that's in fact the original meaning of the word economics, right? Is that the word means the law of the household in Greek. So that the money or the finance, and in our case, the decision making about what job and where and for how much and at what cost of time, biblically should go under the heading of the family rather than as its own autonomous sphere. Okay. That when economics gets set up in our thinking, either at a high academic level or at a low level of, do I want to take this job, and completely separated from the good of the family, either the immediate family, right? How much time am I going to have with my kids, or the extended family, what you realize is that, oh, I guess that money was actually supposed to be there to help the family. An easy way to notice this on a macro level is when economic decisions are made without any respect for the local community and its families. So that when jobs go away from a place never to return, that has a giant impact on all of those families that now have stress or break up or move elsewhere to get a job or whatever. And that on a personal level, we're often making decisions in that regard, or our families and our congregations are making decisions in that way. And it creates difficulty, stress, and strain on the family that could have been predicted, but it's just not something that we really talk about. In this way, and to finish up as we begin to take questions in the last few minutes here, you might think of the very beginning of the book of Proverbs. The young man is about to set out on his life. Okay, so there's going to be family formation, hopefully. In fact, I would contend the whole book is about finding the right girl, right? You get the wrong girl portrayed early, and then you get the right girl portrayed at the end, right? With all of life smushed in between. So he's going to set out, and he has to form a family. And the instruction that he has learned for life has been learned from the father and the mother, right? So he's supposed to hold on to the teaching of his father and not to abandon what his mother has commanded him, right? So then all of life gets smushed in between his business decision making and the way that he reacts to people and what he says and when he holds his tongue. And as he does that, it's not a matter of just clearly like do these 5 things and then you're going to be fine. It's a life lived in the fear of God, and it's a life that to him is kind of uncertain. And the clarity that he's going to have is going to be on a set of principles which will accord with nature. But he's going to have to figure out what that looks like. And he's going to have to return to it, right? That's why they're phrased as aphorisms, because the more that you come back and think about them, the more you find. When he does that, the purpose is so that the family can go on. Not only in its financial or economic well-being, like you see, for instance, in chapter 31, with how diligent his prospective wife is going to be in her vocation, but also that the family will actually endure, so that you could imagine the book starting all over again in the next generation, with the guy who was the son in chapter 1 now instructing his son in another book of Proverbs. We can pass it down and it is sustainable. It's not soon to be disintegrated the way we often see in the lives around us. Let's take some questions or some comments, and we will then have a break, I think, for about a half hour, and then talk about the church. Dr. Berge. Yeah, it's early, and I mean, I just talked for an hour, but they're getting warmed up.
I saw the jest. This is kind of like an auctioneer thing. Those are both like a wingle the ear thing.
Yeah, I was wondering about,
Yeah.
For pastors or future pastors with this concept of being close to family, right?
Yeah.
How do you deal with a call that might take you very, very far from family?
Yeah. I'm in a call like that right now. I would say that there's kind of 2 ways to think about it. Number one is it's definitely on my mind that both of our parents, one set being in Minnesota, one set being in Pennsylvania, are not getting any younger. Okay. So you have duties as a pastor outside of being a pastor. And if you can attend to those by any means, you should. Okay. The other thing to think about is if you have duties as a pastor that take you away, that's to be expected. It's part of the kingdom of God that you lose certain things for the sake of the kingdom. But you don't have to act like that was good in and of itself. It's still a loss. Right? So it doesn't have to be, well, I was so far away and I missed all this, but it was fine, because it's still a loss, right? And I like to just acknowledge things as losses and just to be honest about it, rather than telling myself that somehow it's okay. It's still a loss. Yep.
You sparked a thought about, dealing with the church, people within the church, that how would you minister to a young person in the church who no longer believes that she is she now thinks she's a he?
Yeah.
How would you speak to that person?
Okay. Yep. And we do that because it's Denver. So we're like San Francisco, but with mountains, right? So it depends on what you like. I personally like beaches more than mountains, but I got San Francisco with mountains. Number one, you have to recognize you are in a position of severe disadvantage, because almost nothing else, except maybe her parents, are going to reinforce what you're going to say. She's going to get approval from everybody else for what's going on. Okay. So you're at a position of severe disadvantage. I mean, it's kind of like handling a divorce that way. Usually by the time you're dealing with it, it's probably too late, but you just accept that, right? So number two, that you're dealing with a situation of admonition. You can phrase it however you want. You can be as calm and peaceful about expressing it however you want. But it's a situation of admonition. You are about to do something you will severely regret because it is against your nature and you're destroying yourself by doing it. Okay. So in a case like that, like with other things where maybe you warn somebody, it's going to be 5-6 years before she agrees with you. You're not saying it to experience a rush of vindication 5 or 6 years from now, but you are saying it because nobody else is going to say that. And it's not going to be told to them clearly. Because part of the whole game here, and you can see this if you have ever examined the story of a detransitioner, is that she'll say something like, I went through everything, I got the surgery, I got the drug regimen, I did everything. And then I'm kind of rethinking it when I'm 18 or 19, once I come out of whatever, especially in my friend group for girls, pushed me to do this. Now, as I come out of it, I'm trying to call my doctor and she's not picking up anymore. So it's kind of a clear-cut situation of admonition. This is going to destroy things you're never going to get back exactly. So I can say that, I mean, I'm not angry about it. I'm just telling you. That's the thing that I like about the concept of nature. It's just there no matter how I feel about it. So when I talk about it, I never have to be, I think Christians and ministers particularly are sort of pigeonholed as if we're like angry. I mean, I'm not angry about it. I just think it's horrible. Like, I'm not worked up, but you're destroying things. And that's what's going to happen. Yeah.
I love the language of fortress that you're using here, particularly when I think of family.
Yeah.
How do we avoid, I think of John Calvin, he says, like, our hearts are idol factories, right? How do you avoid that fortress becoming an idol where you kind of go in and seal off your family from the rest of the big bad world, like taking that mentality, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the family is not something that is ever going to be sealed off, right? So if that's your imagination, you're trying to do something that is impossible. It's not sealed off. That doesn't mean, like, I have a very severe disagreement with Hugh Halter. I don't know if you guys know Hugh Halter at all. He does missional church planting type stuff. He's got this whole rant against homeschooling. Well, my 10-year-old is not equipped to be a missionary to his public school teacher. So that's why we do a homeschool co-op at our church. I don't think I'm sealing them off, so I mean, we just drive around. My kids know everything about pride flags because of where we live. Like, they know the different permutations of them because there are so many. So there's no possibility to be sealed off, but there is a need to protect. Protecting is not sealing, right? Sealing is not possible. Protecting actually is, okay? And then you decide in your wisdom, and I think this is where older generations can be helpful, is that you decide how that protection gets eased up, because what you see at the beginning of Proverbs is, okay, he's going to be fully gone now, right? That's why the book is there. Yeah.